Plymouth Regional Economic Development Foundation is a private, nonprofit organization based in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The foundation's focus, as the region's economic development leader, is on land use, workforce and small business development, innovation and entrepreneurship, and marketing, events, and cultural affairs. Julie Thompson spoke with Executive Director Stephen Cole about what's new and next for the foundation.
Stephen Cole, the Executive Director of the Plymouth Regional Economic Development Foundation, Incorporated. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to start with kind of a brief history of how the foundation got started and what is its mission right now.
Oh, brief history. Well, dark and stormy night 20 years ago. A handful of very intelligent young men got together. They were young back then, but the fact of the matter is some people decided at that time that it was important for the town to have a function, a purpose that invites in investment, that diversifies the economy. The fact is, even today, 85% of the tax base is residential, and it was about that then too. So 20 years ago, they decided that an economic development entity, oftentimes referred to as EDCs, was necessary. EDCs are sometimes part of the government. Many of them are outside of the government, and that's how the foundation is incorporated. We are a private nonprofit foundation. It's important to note that the forethought of my four founders structured us as a foundation for the purposes of achieving a certain IRS tax status.
Okay.
Now, the foundation, as a designation, has to get about 5% of our assets over a 3-year aggregate back into the community. So it's not enough that we're a nonprofit and we're tax exempt for providing a critical need to the community. We also have a certain obligation that we put on ourselves to ensure that we are funding important things that we want to see in the community. Among those things are land use. We're very concerned about how land is used in our community. It's worth noting that we don't want to see development for development's sake. It's important to note that people want to live here and want to be here because of the character of this community. We don't want to change that character. We just want to make sure that we have a sustainable economic base so that if ever something like a pandemic happens, if we're too heavily focused on things like tourism and retail, obviously we see the effects on that. And so one of the things that we're focused on is land use. Another thing is what we call MECA, marketing, events, and cultural assets. That's intended to help promote our #1 industry, which is tourism.
Right.
Thirdly, we focus on things like entrepreneurship and innovation, and small business development as a separate item, and then workforce development. And I'll say workforce development as a standalone, we weren't necessarily concerned about that prior to COVID because our region and the state, for that matter, reflected 2.8% unemployment.
Right.
Functional for the most part.
Right.
But this is also an opportunity for us in some ways because that labor pool is so seismically disrupted and because we know we're not going to go back to normal the way we understood it prior to COVID. So focusing on entrepreneurship as a way to help build our workforce development is something that we're particularly focused on now as part of our mission.
And you always mention entrepreneurship. Every time I've ever heard you talk, that word is always in the sentence. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a little while. So what different town or regional entities do you have to work with on the multiple projects that you end up being involved with at any given time?
You know, I want to answer that by first bringing attention to our name because you correctly emphasized Regional Economic Development Foundation. Right. We are headquartered in Plymouth. Plymouth is the region's economic engine, though. You know, we share a major highway with Taunton, and Taunton is technically our core MSA, right? But the fact of the matter is Plymouth is coming into its own in a lot of different ways. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. In fact, I look forward to talking about that later. But where we are right now in terms of Plymouth's growth trajectory, I just want to touch on for a second, it obviously takes an entire region because we don't have enough people even in our own community to fill all of the jobs in our community.
Yes.
And so with that regard, the things that we build in Plymouth, and this is really my vision, this is what I hope the board is able to achieve over the next decade or so, we want to see more responsible commercial development occurring here in Plymouth. And residential is going to happen. But I'd like to see more of that happen in communities surrounding Plymouth, like Kingston, like Carver, like Plimpton even. Those communities need residential development.
Right.
Our community needs commercial development.
Right.
So that's kind of what we're focused on.
And they feed each other.
And they feed each
beautifully.
other. Correct. Yeah, because these people commune in from someplace.
Right.
And so to answer your question now a little more succinctly, right? Who are we working with? Well, the state's our most important partner.
The state.
The state.
Okay.
And I mean that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and its various entities, from the governor right through all the departments to the legislature. In fact, I'm very proud to say one of my board members is Matt Moratori, our very own state rep. He is a great bridge to the various and the myriad departments and agencies that we rely on. I'll say this about the state. It's partly my mission to make sure they know that Plymouth is more than just seasonal traffic and cranberry bogs.
Right.
We have an awful lot of really cool things happening down here and a lot of commercial and economic activity and still yet room to grow. But we need the state to understand what we're trying to achieve here so that we can help attract their attention and perhaps even some of their investment.
So that's the bottom line. It's to get financial support from the state and maybe expertise from all different levels in state government that could be utilized here. With the foundation could utilize them. And if they don't know about it, that's the problem. Okay.
That's an excellent point. And I just want to say one thing. When the Speaker of the House stands up and he says it is now an economic development priority for the state to invest in wind in the southeast of Massachusetts, that's partly what I mean. When we see the Southeast Corridor rail being built out, that goes from New Bedford, Fall River, New Bedford, up into Boston, they segment out Plymouth. And we're working really hard to get a portion of our commuter rail back.
Right.
So regional entities and the state's partnership is super important, but I can't discount how important it is too to work with our regulatory partners on the local level, at the state level. Conservation commissions, boards of health, certainly planning boards, ZBAs, et cetera. So we can't get anything done ourselves alone.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, that's great. What would you say your greatest achievements to date are? Your greatest achievements?
To date. Well, I recently took up GTA and gaming over the pandemic, and I was able to purchase the vehicle I was looking forward to. In my career, I have to say my greatest achievement probably comes from my time in Hartford. Because it was in Hartford that I learned not only how cool it is, but how important it is to work with entrepreneurs and innovators. That's the long game. You don't get the results right away. But when you do get results, oh boy, they're explosive. And I will say one of my favorite things that I like to tell people about working with entrepreneurs is don't expect to be successful until you're in your 40s. Because time and again, when you look at the largest businesses and companies and corporations that we all rely on, from Netflix to Sony to fill in the blanks, Amazon, every one of the founders of those companies, they were in their 40s. And so it's an important life lesson, I think, for a lot of folks to realize that frustration and failure is part of the process. But our demographics are so well positioned. In fact, our median age is 47. So that means here in Plymouth County. So when you take the fact that we check a lot of the boxes for what the entrepreneurial profile is, to say nothing of the fact we're a blue collar community. I defy anyone watching to not find someone at home who can use a coffee can 8 different ways before it has to be thrown away. That's the basis of something, innovation, right?
So just let me go back to Hartford for a second. What exactly with entrepreneurs happened in Hartford that you're so proud of?
So while I was in Hartford, I was learning about what some of these entrepreneurs were working on and what they needed. And there was a funding opportunity that came out of the EDA, the Economic Development Administration. They're a federal agency nestled within the U.S. Commerce Department.
So that's the feds.
That was the feds.
Okay, the feds. This is the state, this is federal.
That's right. To get federal attention means sometimes you can ultimately influence federal policy and funding obligations or funding opportunities. That said, there was a program at that time called Strong Cities, Strong Communities, SC2. We were one of 3 cities in the entire nation that were funded. And if it sounds like I'm boasting a little, I am.
Good.
Because I wrote that application.
And what did it do? What did this funding do?
Well, it basically created a platform for entrepreneurs to tell us what they're working on and what the city of Hartford needs to do in order for them to be successful to get into that next stage. Whether it's zoning changes, whether it's making available space, funding, even investment in the arts actually came out of that conversation because dynamism and attraction and activity comes from the arts community. And so part of the entrepreneurial profile that we learned in Hartford included the arts. I carry that forward with me here to Plymouth. And just to answer your question succinctly about the achievement, we applied for $1 million and we got $1 million.
That's great.
And I'm very glad to say every single dollar went back into the community to support entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
Life lessons learned there, now being on the ground here in Plymouth, very different community than Hartford.
Yeah.
Half the population, in fact.
Yep.
Twice as much opportunity, I'd say.
Yes. Yes. Great. Awesome. What are your most lofty plans moving forward? And I know you have many.
Well, I really want to level up on GTA, but I think where I am right now, we have to look toward the next 50 years.
Okay.
And what I mean by
50.
50 years,
Okay.
50.
Yep.
And the reason I focus on 50 is because it's a little arbitrary, but it's 2 generations. 50 years is 2 generations, and that comes very quick.
Yeah.
Also, 50 years is for how long the power plant was operating. Now, cordage, by contrast, went for quite a bit longer,
Yes, quite a
120
bit
some
longer.
odd years,
Yep,
right?
yep.
7 generations, in fact, were employed at cordage. 2 generations were employed at the power
Pilgrim.
plant.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So when I think about the next 50 years, it's really the things that we need to do now that lay the groundwork so that we can expect these higher energy uses, manufacturing, precision manufacturing. Industry is not the way it used to be either. I will say this, there's at least one company here in Plymouth that's under contract to produce parts for SpaceX. There are companies here in Plymouth that launch research vessels, submarines, out of our bay. So looking at what activities are already occurring and what we need to do to support them so that they can grow is as important to me as making sure that we have the right regulations in place to attract the right type of investment so that we can get the types of jobs here that are outside of things like restaurant and retail.
Right.
It genuinely is a lofty goal of mine to not just change the economy of this place, but also partly the culture, how we think about ourselves
Right.
and our self-worth on the global stage, because Plymouth is international.
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. So when you're talking about looking, 25, 50 years into the future, no one has the crystal ball, and no one predicted what was going to happen in 2020. Nobody predicted this pandemic. But technology, the change in the climate, all the things that we have to think about. How do you circle that square with the fact that you don't have a crystal ball? You don't know what 10 years from now, what new opportunities might present themselves. So how do you decide this is what I'm going to go after for now because I see that this is going to last for at least 10 years or 15 years or 20 years? How do you make that decision?
Oh, that's a great question. It really comes down to what any small business or nonprofit might do. It's what problems do you want to solve? What problems are there that you think you can actually solve? For us, well, once I learned that we had 10,000 megawatts coming offline in New England, energy is really important to our quality of life.
Right.
And I'll pause here to say economic development is about enhancing quality of life. If economics is about managing scarce resources, economic development is another layer, because it's about using those scarce resources, including in Plymouth, land, so that you can achieve a higher quality of life.
Sure.
So when you think about energy coming offline, how do we bring in more energy in a non-invasive way? A power plant that closes in our backyard does not necessarily beget another power plant.
Right.
So the state, for what it's worth, has done an extensive amount of research and determined that this state needs to invest heavily in solar and wind. So some of it's identifying the problems, Julie, but some of it also is taking the lead from where our higher levels of government are interested in funding. I mentioned just a second ago wind and solar. The federal government, in fact, one of the most comprehensive pieces of bipartisan legislation to come out of the last 4 years was the Quantum Leadership Act. This is something that typically you don't look at on a local level, but the feds, when I say the feds, I mean in this case, the Congress has actually determined 98-0-2 in the Senate that this nation's national defense must focus on things like quantum research and development, quantum computing.
So for anyone who doesn't know exactly what that means, can you define quantum development?
Quantum computing is really just higher levels of processing power.
Okay.
Yep. So when you look at new industries that are starting and burgeoning, things like even coastal resiliency and climate change, there's an enormous amount of data that needs to be analyzed.
Yes.
And I dare say we see a lot of people now going into space on the regular. There's an enormous amount of data that comes out of those trips. It's not just a free ride, so to speak, or a fun ride. There's an enormous amount of data that comes out of that. That needs to be digested too. The only thing that is going to help us process complex equations, complex computing problems is through higher levels of processing power, and that comes from quantum. The feds right now want to make sure that small businesses, research and development firms are focusing on quantum computing because it's part of not only an economic development opportunity, it creates high-paying jobs. It uses less amount of land than something like a warehouse.
Right.
It's also very energy intensive.
So are you talking servers?
Yes, things like that. Yeah, but really just think of supercomputers.
Okay. And so this is hardware, but it's also the software.
Yep.
So the people that write these codes that make this happen.
And this is a higher level of employment that our residents can fill, especially as they get older. Because one of the things I'm deeply concerned about, going back to problems and the things that we choose to focus on, I'm as concerned about demographic shifts.
Right.
We have an aging population. And that means that certain city services are going to become very important for those folks and become a lot more popular.
Yeah.
The other thing I concern myself with is, on average, 70 cents of every dollar in taxes goes to the schools. Most of the residential that's being built in this area is age restricted 55. So kids who are graduating high school today, they can't even gain access to some of the homes that we're building today for the next 40 years.
Right. Right.
So that concerns me. All of these things from a regional perspective, Julie, ultimately determine what we're going to work on.
Okay.
But some of those marching orders do come from higher levels of government.
Okay, so you have to be tuned in and pay attention.
Must.
Okay, to what's going on. So, Plymouth. Why is Plymouth such a breeding ground for possibilities?
Because our quality of life is already really high. When you think about common urban problems, right? Post-industrial cities like Boston, Worcester, Holyoke, Springfield, great places, right? Wonderful places to be. We're separate and unique, though. I mean, and look, a rose by any other name is still a rose. We're 63,000 people. We're organized as the town of Plymouth. But we're also the only community, I dare say city in New England, that is post-nuclear. We're not post-industrial. And so I'm trying to figure out what exactly that means. The next 50 years are going to ultimately tell us what that is.
Yep.
But looking at the conditions on the ground right now, we see a lot of activity with AI. We see some activity.
AI, artificial intelligence.
Yes, and also augmented reality. They're getting away from using the word artificial intelligence.
I know.
But we have automation is really another one of the terms that they're automated intelligence in some regards.
Right.
Those are the types of things that are going to create the type of data that we need to use to be successful in mitigating things like climate change.
Yep.
But also, it's the quantum computing that I just mentioned a moment ago that's going to help us crunch that data. Plymouth residents are better positioned to invite those types of industries into our community, partly because we don't have to worry about fixing the problems from the last 50 years.
Right.
And what I mean by that are things like brownfields. Some of the other communities that I've lived and worked, it was as expensive to develop as Manhattan. And you wouldn't get a fraction of the return on that investment, and it's partly because of the industrial past for those communities.
Right, which we did not have.
That's right.
Yeah, we don't have that hanging on our shoulders. Plymouth is the biggest town land-wise in the whole state?
By landmass, yeah.
Can you talk about that whole, and how does that play in?
Sure. You know, one of the greatest misnomers I like to point out to people is that Plymouth is, of course, the largest town by landmass, but we talk about it like it's 101 or 103 square miles.
Yep.
The sources are a little ambiguous. The fact is, anybody who at home wants to wiki this right now will see that it's 134 square miles.
Okay.
We don't include our waterways.
Okay.
We don't include our bay.
Yeah.
As part of our land mass, and that's understandable. But the fact of the matter is, we're cleaving off 40 potential square miles of potentially developable area to help us achieve our economic, national security, and local conservation goals.
So, how do you do that? What can the bay offer that it doesn't offer now? What is the waterways? What does that mean for our future?
Sure. You know, well, let's talk about what it does offer now. We already have a couple of startup oyster farms here in town, right? I mentioned earlier we have research vessels that launch in town. I believe that if we were to build on their successes and offer greater paths forward for them to expand their businesses, then we would see more interested parties. What's more, we have a supply chain already built into our community that a lot of communities don't already have, and that's the restaurants. What are you going to do with oysters once they're mature? You sell them.
Sure.
You sell them so people can eat them.
Right.
We have restaurants here in town, restaurants that would be very interested in having those things. Right. Kelp is another one that I frankly want to talk a little bit about, because when you have 40 square miles to play with, right?
Yeah.
30 some odd square miles to play with, you can have large tracts of that space used for things like kelp, which under the best conditions can grow 1,800% a day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we could have kelp salads fresh, from basically farm to table, but our harbor to table. So there's lots of types of businesses that I think could be supported in the harbor, to say nothing of the AI that can happen there too. Lots of businesses could operate, and I'll point out something that MIT is working on. They have shallow water crafts right now in the Charles. Maybe if MIT, who's watching, will want to graduate their program and go into deeper waters, I invite them to reach out to us and work with us, so that we can work with the harbor master and we can give them access into our harbor so that they can gain additional data and information.
So these are all informational gathering.
And we don't even know what they can do with that information once it's gathered, though.
Okay.
It could be another type of a business. They could identify new types of problems or solutions.
So one thing that comes to mind when you talk about using water as a new kind of a place to create new businesses that don't exist, does it have to be zoned? I mean, does that create a new zoning issue?
Not at all. No, because you zone land, you don't zone the water.
Oh,
And that's one of the things that I think is going to be beneficial to us. I mean, we have access to partners in the north.
Yeah.
You can go north in Plymouth, you can go south in Plymouth, you can go west in Plymouth.
Yep.
And only until fairly recently do we realize we can also develop east.
Explain that.
Because we're not restricted by cutting down trees. We're not restricted
Right.
by zoning.
Right.
And as long as the harbor master and the town select board is pleased that what is happening there is consistent with the character of our community and
Right.
doesn't cause any detriment, but in fact actually creates value and economic opportunity, then I think it's an obvious solution for us that not a lot of other communities can capitalize on.
Right. So in the harbor, there was talk about bringing small cruise ships in. And what about like a commuter boat to Boston? I mean, how is that? How does all that play into economic development?
You know, so many cities are trying to recapture their waterways because once upon a time they either
Yeah.
used them for pollutants
That was it.
or
Yep.
heavy industry.
Yep.
Highways bifurcated cities from their waterways in a lot of cases.
Yep.
Plymouth never really divorced ourselves from our water, but we never really recreated on our water much either.
Right.
We love our beaches. We
Yep.
protect our beaches. But to your point, there's not a lot of water vessel out there that can get you into Boston.
No.
And although we're only 30 miles south of Boston, it takes a day and a half sometimes to get there, it feels, right?
Right.
A ferry could do that with ease, not just for commuting purposes,
Yeah.
but also help enhance our tourism portfolio too. I've said this to you before, and I think it bears mentioning here now. I used to live in Salem for a time.
Yep.
I could get on the ferry in Salem, and as a Salem resident, pay a discounted rate and take that ferry into Boston. And without getting another ticket, I could take that ferry off into P-Town.
Oh, wow.
So there was a connectivity between the North Shore with Boston and even at least one destination like P-Town.
Right.
We're 45 miles north of Providence. A lot of people, in fact, from Rhode Island and Providence work in our restaurants here. So we already have that natural connection.
Right.
And we're 30 miles south of Boston.
Right.
So
Plymouth really is a hub. I mean,
Oh, sure.
The Cape, the islands, Providence, Boston. What is missing that we are not identified more as a hub?
I think that's partly why I want to focus on the entrepreneurship,
Yeah.
because that's kind of a young person's game, so to speak.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of these opportunities in Rhode Island or even throughout Massachusetts. So if we had a draw to bring people here who are smart, young, startups who want to invest in our community, and the community will help them grow. That's kind of what I want, Julie. That's what I think we're missing. We're missing the draw to bring younger people in here.
And new businesses, new types of businesses in
Yes.
here. And can I just ask about the convention center, because I know that is something that is definitely on the drawing board.
Yeah, I'm glad to be working with C. Plymouth, Lee Filson, a very good friend of mine, great visionary herself. Lee's goal is largely to enhance and strengthen the tourism industry.
Sure.
And our goal is, of course, to really strengthen all industries, but to diversify our economy.
Yep.
And one of the ways I think we can do that while achieving both at the same time is by working on something like a sizable or scalable convention hall or conference center. There isn't anything south of Boston, and frankly, Boston doesn't appeal to a lot of the types of conferences that I think we could attract down here.
Right.
I mentioned also we're 45 miles north of Providence.
Yeah.
It may not be just people driving in from Massachusetts who might want to have a conference here. I mentioned earlier Plymouth is international. There could be separate international groups that want to have some kind of a conference here also. I mention it because not only does that enhance our tourism profile, but within a 40-mile radius of Plymouth, there are 4.9 million people. 4.9 million people live within 40 miles of Plymouth.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible.
So it's not just business conferences, it's things like gaming conferences or esports, and they spend money differently, and they're interested in doing different activities than the midweek businessman, right?
Right.
So one of the things that I think that the conference center, conference hall can achieve for us is helping to diversify our economy, bring people into our community midweek and
Yeah.
off season.
Yeah,
but
especially
it also,
off season.
Yep, and it
Yeah.
also gives us an opportunity. I mean, imagine the types of jobs that are created from running and scheduling and
Oh.
managing a facility like that.
Sure.
So it gives our residents an opportunity to not only graduate their own social economic status,
Yep.
But it also does achieve a lot of the same things that tourism seeks to achieve too.
Excellent. Let me just ask you a question about land. There's always there's kind of two camps of you want to keep undeveloped land undeveloped because it's beautiful and it's nice to have a lot of open space, and yet you know that you need the tax base of economic development and people that are not just residents paying taxes, but businesses. How do you serve both of those masters without upsetting either of them? And how can you bring that together?
So I'll give you one scenario. I mentioned AI earlier. There is an AI startup company based here in Plymouth now, I'm very glad to say, Bright Automation. I asked them what their space needs were. I was expecting a whole building, Julie. What they came back with was 144 square feet.
Square feet?
144 square feet is what they need for their startup. And that's another reason why we focus on startups. You don't need as much space for a startup as something that's like a GE, right?
Yes.
But the fact is, too, I want to focus on types of businesses that don't eat up a lot of land, because I think that eating up our land will take away from the character of our community.
Yep.
And I've worked with developers before, and I've simply asked them to do things like a tree census. If you cut down a 10-inch tree, caliber tree, you're not going to be able to replace 10-inch tree right away, right? I mean, so one of the things I've said is I'll take 10 1-inch saplings that over, say, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years will each grow into a 10-inch significant tree, right? So the order of magnitude at that point is they cut down one 10-inch tree. Now we have 10 1-inch trees that will each be 10-inch trees in a certain period of time.
Absolutely. Okay.
And I understand, too, that you don't necessarily put that back on the land where you cut it down from, because the reason you removed it.
Exactly.
One of the things that I've done in my past communities is identify where deforestation is happening, not just from human interference, but from invasive species.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the things that I relish and like to share with people is that these 70-foot pines that we see, that we're so desperate to protect, they're actually as invasive, because they're not the original trees that were from here. It's scrub pine and scrub oak that were supposed to be here. Fire-resilient trees.
Right.
The ones we have now are actually slightly invasive. They're not susceptible to the types of bacteria that we sometimes see, or fungus. There are some insects that are destroying some of the trees that we see down on Federal Furnace. I defy anybody to just drive down Federal Furnace and you can see how many dead trees there are.
Wow.
So I mentioned that partly, Julie, because there are ways that we can solve old problems with new money, and I'm of the mind that in a space where we have lots of dead trees, we can cull those dead trees, make that space suitable for development, work with the developer to replace the trees that were removed, and frankly, now the community's even better off.
Right.
We have new investment, we have higher paying jobs, and we have a corporate constituent or a corporate resident who cares about preserving the quality of our character.
Right, which we can't ever lose.
Which we can never lose.
Right.
That's what makes us uniquely distinct from every other place in the Commonwealth.
Right. And the last thing I'll just ask is people can't really get involved with the foundation, as far as I can't volunteer for the foundation like you can for a lot of nonprofits. But how do people get in touch, and why do they get in touch with you at any given time?
Well, I'm glad you asked. If someone at home is interested in starting a business or a nonprofit, nonprofits are businesses too, right? And they all seek to solve problems. Feel free to reach out to us. We've had some success in actually starting up some nonprofits here in town over the last couple of years, as well as some for-profit businesses. So I guess that's why someone might reach out to us and ask us for our services. But there are ways that you can still get involved if you like what we're working on, if you believe in diversifying our tax base, sustaining our economy in a way that is also sustainable to our character. Well, frankly, we're subject to the democratic process just like everyone else.
Right.
So the land that we have to work with and the space that we have to develop economic opportunity on, a lot of that is determined at town meeting level, or select board level, or planning board level.
Yeah.
So frankly, I mean, if there's any one thing I can encourage people to do, it's to get involved with the democratic process on a local level, because that is a very influential role to serve.
Of course. And be aware that you are acutely aware of the many different eyes that would be on any one project. And you have to kind of look at that project from all the different perspectives and try to cull out anything that's going to be a deal breaker, and find out how you can make a solution out of that.
Yep.
Yeah.
I've never worked on a project that wasn't made better because of the democratic process.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Well, this has been great. I mean, we could talk for 7 hours, but I'm sure we'll have you back on more specific projects, because it's nice sometimes to just hone in on one or two. But thank you so much
Thanks
for
for
today.
having me.
This is great. Stephen Cole, good to have you.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this video by The Local Scene, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. Thank you for watching.